I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.
And thank you all very much for coming this morning. Welcome to you all. My name's Brian Anderson. I'm the editor of City Journal, whose 20th anniversary we're reflecting on today. 20 years ago, when City Journal's first issue appeared, New York, like many American cities, seemed to be dying. Crime was terrifying, omnipresent. 2,262 people were murdered in the city that year, an all-time high. And every other kind of crime, from auto theft to rape, was raging out of control. Disorder had become matter of fact, from graffiti scrawling its ugliness everywhere to parks transformed into homeless encampments and drug marts. The experts said nothing could be done about any of this, really, short of some kind of revolution in American society, since crime and disorder were understandable responses to an uncaring and unjust society. Now, uncaring was a ridiculous charge. In fact, New York, like other cities, was suffering from a kind of hypertrophy of care. Municipal government had been transformed to some extent into a vast provider of services to the poor. The result, though, was not what was intended. Welfare became a trap, a multi-generational, spirit-crushing way of life, with welfare rolls here in New York at well over 1 million people in 1990. Public schools were overly bureaucratized failures, dominated by trendy but ineffective pedagogy and too many time-serving teachers, impossible to fire. Businesses, overtaxed and overregulated, were fleeing in droves. Ask a typical New Yorker back then if they wanted to get out of the city permanently, and a majority said yes. Now, looking at today's city, that mostly, though not entirely, seems like a bad dream. Our radically improved reality has a lot to do with the implementation of ideas developed and argued for in the pages of this magazine over the last 20 years. To talk about the history and future of urban reform, for not all cities have followed New York's path out of looming disaster, and the gains of recent years need constant defending, and about the role of ideas in transforming policies, about the importance of infrastructure in preserving the urban successes of recent years, and much more, including City Journal's own role in all of this, we've assembled a great group of speakers this morning. Their full biographies are in your folders, but let me very briefly introduce them in order of appearance. First up will be the Honorable Stephen Goldsmith, currently the Deputy Mayor of New York City, a former two-term mayor of Indianapolis, and one of the great practitioners of policy transformation in American urban history. Steve served as an advisor to President George W. Bush, has taught government at Harvard, and is the author or co-author of several books, the most recent of which is The Power of Social Innovation. Heather McDonald is a contributing editor of City Journal and the John M. Olin Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. She's the author of 2 books, The Burden of Bad Ideas and Are Cops Racist, and co-author of a third, The Immigration Solution. In addition to her incredible award-winning reporting for City Journal on everything from jails to the future of classical music, Heather writes frequently for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, and the Los Angeles Times, among other publications. Nicole Gelinas is a contributing editor of City Journal and the Searle Freedom Trust Fellow at the Institute. Her prescient, clear writings on the financial crisis in our pages and in her recent book, After the Fall, Saving Capitalism from Wall Street and Washington, have won acclaim from Steve Forbes, Richard Posner, and many others, and she's a regular columnist in the New York Post and has written for many other major publications. Steve Malanga is City Journal's senior editor, a columnist for Real Clear Markets, and he writes frequently for the Wall Street Journal as well. His brand new book, Shakedown, The Continuing Conspiracy Against the American Taxpayer, is essential reading on the crisis in government budgets facing states and cities across the country. Now, we've got a lot to get in this morning, but we'll try to leave time after each speaker for a few questions. I will field the questions, and please wait for the mic since we're being filmed. The speakers will be available at the reception before lunch if you have further questions to ask them. And now, Deputy Mayor Steve Goldsmith.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. I think the way this works essentially is that City Journal and other MI publications print these great ideas. I apply them, and then they invite me here to compliment me on my judgment. So thank you very much. It's a virtuous circle, I think they would say. Let me just make a few very brief introductory comments. I've been the beneficiary of the work of the Manhattan Institute and City Journal in particular for the full period of time that the journal's been published. It's all obvious to you because the reason you're here, but let me just kind of encapsulate that. In the early 90s, as Brian referenced, when a few of us were elected mayors in about the same couple-year period of time, Ed Rendell and myself and Rich Daley, and then shortly thereafter, Rudy, we came from this period of time where cities were thought to be kind of pathological places from which recovery was impossible. And also that the progressive movement had suggested that the only way out would be a massive wealth redistribution, as if you could kind of buy your way out of poverty by kind of and buy your way into wealth by redistribution alone. And so that felt pretty bad and pretty hopeless. And then yet in this period, City Journal was advocating not for an abandonment of cities and not for saving the cities with the same old recipe that hadn't worked, that had forced wealth out of cities and had, I think, played a part in actually the development of the pathologies about which we complain. But City Journal was saying, look, the cities are great places, and there's a different way to think about kind of recreating those great places. And you know, as you read that and thought a little bit more about, you know, in the rest of that Jane Jacobs literature, there's a little bit that says that cities are great places because they're a path to the middle class, right? We grow the middle class in cities. Yet in the early 90s, and to some extent again today, what cities did with a too liberal agenda is they actually sent the middle class out of the city, right? And then occasionally, in order to gentrify, they imported the middle class, but we kind of made sure that instead of creating a middle class, we were exporting a middle class. So how do you turn cities around to be great places again? And the City Journal recipe for that is one that many of us endorsed, and I think it truly was the primary blueprint for Democrat or Republican mayors who viewed themselves as reformers beginning in the early 90s and on to, again, today. And the thoughts of the City Journal that I applied, and again, this is speaking to the, I mean, many people in the audience tell me what to think, and then I repeat it back, so I'm a little humbled about that. But let me just kind of, let me do it in a couple of ways. One, it was clear we had to start to grow wealth again, right? That every government redistributes wealth to some extent, but the idea that you can be great without creating wealth seemed counterintuitive or wrong. And so as City Journal paid attention to job creation and the development of opportunity and reducing regulatory barriers so small businesses could do better, or rethinking the way we zoned, and all the other things that City Journal has written about, those became ways to grow wealth. And when you grow wealth, you grow opportunity. When you grow wealth and opportunity, you grow the middle class, and we're back in business again, and we've seen how that works. And so, you know, point one is this kind of optimistic, hopeful, conservative message that opportunity does make a difference. And for those of us, you know, urban Republicans, and there aren't a lot of us urban Republicans, this is a pretty important message, whether you view yourself as a moderate Democrat or a moderate Republican or somebody who cares about cities. The idea that we can grow opportunity again is very, you know, it's the reason I got into politics, right? It's the reason I wanted to be a politician. It's the reason I wanted to be mayor, is to do this. So that was kind of point one. You know, point two is are the issues that Heather writes about a lot. You know, values matter. Right? You can't create civic vitality and civic society just with the force of government alone. And I'd say with respect to the more conservative views of my party 10 years ago, that it's not just the absence of bad government that creates vital communities, right? There's something more than just the absence of bad that's necessary. And so to recognize that the kids have more success in life if they grow up in two-parent households, that personal responsibility makes a difference in the way a city functions, neighborhood functions, a family functions, and that's a key component to how a vibrant city should take hold and flourish, is critically important, and obviously flows through the City Journal articles and columns in a very significant way, as it does the rest of the Manhattan Institute literature. And then third, obviously, there's something to be said about urban spaces themselves. I always found, you know, I'm just from Indianapolis, or I guess I'm now from New York, but I think of myself as from Indianapolis, and I think the pictures in the back of the City Journal about great urban spaces are very exciting, right? And whether it's a you know, it's a Robert Moses approach and big and great, or whether it's Mayor Bloomberg trying to, you know, reinvigorate the park system and the other green spaces in the city, these make a difference. And so if you think of a city as a great place with a mixture of great people, great policies, and great spaces, it all comes together in the City Journal. I have a, you know, kind of a wonderful opportunity here to take these ideas and see if I can make a little bit of a difference in New York City that has a mayor that understands that we are dangerously close to kind of pricing ourselves kind of out of competitive marketplaces, that the cost of doing business is too high, that the wealth redistribution, that we're forcing people out of the city, and we can't do that. And we put these pieces together, and you know, I've been a mayor, teaching mayors, or working with mayors now, and counting my period as district attorney, for 30 years. And I really honestly believe that there is no other organization that has had such a positive influence on urban spaces and urban opportunities and the people that live in them as has the City Journal, and I'm just terribly honored to be able to kind of kick off today's work and to thank MI, its contributors, donors, and Larry in particular for their leadership. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Just get myself together here. It's an honor to be part of this great institution, and I'm so delighted to be asked to speak today. Well, conservatives, it turns out, are a modest lot. Conservative ideas, though routinely mocked in the mainstream culture, are responsible for the two great urban policy successes of the last quarter century: the breathtaking drops in crime and in welfare dependency since the early 1990s. You'd never know it from members of the opinion elite, however, who have rarely recognized these successes, much less their provenance. Meanwhile, conservatives sit quietly on their hands waiting for somebody else to give them credit. So this morning, I'm going to recapitulate an epic battle about the very foundations of social order. It is a story with not just a clear winner, but also a clear loser. The liberal policy prescriptions for cities that many opinion makers and politicians still embrace. New York has been at the center of this battle because so many of the bad ideas that wreaked havoc on cities for decades were hatched here. Fortunately, so were many of the antidotes. Let's review the core assumptions of liberal urban policy. Number one, multi-generational poverty is the result of structural forces, above all, of rapacious capitalism and racism. It can never be the result of bad decision-making or a deficit of personal responsibility. Number two, though males are still, alas, required for conceiving a child, they are purely optional for raising one. Corollary, the role of illegitimacy in creating and perpetuating poverty must never, ever be acknowledged. Number three, low-wage work is demeaning and pointless. It is better to receive a monthly welfare check than to labor at an entry-level job. Number four, crime is an understandable and inevitable reaction to economic injustice and discrimination. Corollary, The police cannot lower crime. Only government social programs and wealth redistribution can do that. Together, these four conceits compose the most dangerous idea of all, that the bourgeois values of order, self-discipline, and respect for the law are decorative afterthoughts to prosperity rather than its very precondition. From the 1960s onwards, liberal policymakers put these notions into practice just as radical disorder was breaking out in American cities. In the name of economic justice, the welfare rights movement, the brainchild of two New York academics, sought to eliminate all remaining stigma associated with welfare and to sign up as many people for the dole as possible. Within 3 years, welfare rolls in the big US cities had doubled. The urban riots of the 1960s heralded a decades-long outbreak of crime. A presidential commission responded to the growing anarchy in 1967 by recommending that prison sentences actually be shortened or eliminated entirely, and that the police focus on coordinating social services to offenders rather than on making arrests. The states complied, and the national incarceration rate dropped through the 1970s, while judges diverted offenders into social programs. Crime kept rising. By the early 1990s, the fruits of this liberal monopoly over urban policy were in plain view. The national welfare caseload was up 5-fold, as was the nation's illegitimacy rate. In New York City, over 1 in 7 residents were on welfare. An able-bodied New York man whom I interviewed exemplified the pervasive entitlement mentality. He had been mooching off of his girlfriend's welfare check, as he readily confessed, but was applying for his own food stamps. Quote, "I'm going for every dime I can get out of them," he told me. He self-righteously added one caveat, quote, "If they make you work, I'm not doing it," end quote. New York homicides topped 2,000 in 1990. Dealers controlled the streets in New York's poorest neighborhoods. Children slept in bathtubs to avoid stray bullets from the dealers' gun battles. Small businesses were fleeing the city, unable to withstand the assaults on their employees and the constant break-ins. Manhattanites posted pathetic little signs in their cars. No radio. Remember those? Hoping for mercy from the circumambient thieves. But cracks in the dominant ideology were already starting to appear. In the 1980s, states had started making sure that criminals actually served most of their sentences. And the realization that work was a better corrective to poverty than government handouts made federal welfare reform look more and more likely. As this prospect loomed, the poverty-industrial complex erupted in rage. The advocates had the gall to use the very dysfunction and disorder that their policies had produced as an argument against changing the status quo. Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward, the architects of the welfare rights revolution, railed against the idea of asking welfare mothers to work. These mothers already had a full-time job, they said, simply trying to care for their children under the, quote, jungle-like conditions of urban poverty, end quote. Memo to all professors. That jungle is exactly what you get when you dismiss the necessity of the two-parent family, work, and respect for the law. Anticipating federal welfare reform, Marian Wright Edelman of the Children's Defense Fund warns that it would be a, quote, moral blot on this nation, end quote. Charles Rangel predicted that it would throw 1 million people into poverty. Perhaps he could have offered them lodging in his tax-free Dominican villa while he still had it. The most revealing comment, however, came from the Barbara Streisand Professor of Contemporary Gender Studies, yes, there is such a thing, at USC. Welfare reform, said Sharon Hayes, embodies a, quote, serious problem in the cultural logic of personal responsibility itself, end quote. In other words, personal responsibility for the academy has been, quote, problematized. To hold the poor responsible for their actions is philosophically naive. whereas to subsidize self-destructive behavior with unconditional welfare displays philosophical sophistication. President Bill Clinton, to his credit, ignored these doomsayers and in 1996 ended the lifetime entitlement to welfare. The same women whom the advocates had said were incapable of working or unwanted by the economy entered the workforce in droves, a 60% increase in 4 years. The welfare rolls fell 66%, and black child poverty experienced its greatest drop in history. In New York City, where Mayor Rudolph Giuliani had started asking people to go to work a year before federal welfare reform passed, the welfare rolls have dropped 70%. New York now has the lowest child poverty rate of the 8 largest U.S. cities. If any poverty professional has said, "Oops, I was wrong," I haven't heard it. But however significant the rout of the poverty industrial complex, New York's demolition of conventional thinking about crime is even more momentous. Since 1990, New York has experienced the largest and longest sustained drop in street crime of any big city in the developed world. In less than a generation, many of the major felonies have fallen 80% or more. New York did this by rejecting everything that the criminology and social work professions counseled about crime. Police Chief William Bratton announced in 1994 that the police, not some big government welfare program, would lower crime by 10% in his first year. Not only did he meet this goal, he bested it by holding precinct commanders accountable for the safety on their beats, by the rigorous analysis of crime data, and by empowering street cops to intervene in suspicious behavior before a crime actually happens. Just as the liberal philosophy of exempting the poor from bourgeois standards of behavior set up a vicious cycle of fatherlessness, crime, and dependency, the conservative philosophy of universal standards set up a virtuous cycle of urban renovation. With crime in free fall across New York in the 1990s, the tourism and hospitality industries boomed, triggering demand for the low-skilled welfare mothers that welfare reform was nudging into the workplace. Businesses moved back into formerly violence-plagued areas, creating more jobs, and neighborhoods were transformed. To take just one example, let us contemplate for a moment a small miracle that occurs at around 11 p.m. each night at the 96th Street subway station on the Lexington line. Residents pour out of the subway stop and disappear into the darkness, heading unconcernedly home. That's it. For years, such a routine at such an hour would have been fraught with anxiety. Now it is simply part of New York's ordinary rhythm. But it is just such freedom from fear that cities require to achieve the full potential as incubators of creativity. The national crime drop of 41% since 1991 is also the longest and largest national drop in modern history, one wholly unforeseen by criminologists. It was made possible by the increased incarceration rate, which achieved its maximum effect in the 1990s, and by the spread of New York-style data-driven policing. Most significant, the national crime rate has fallen in each of the last 3 years, putting the final nail in the coffin of the liberal conceit that a bad economy drives otherwise law-abiding individuals into crime. In the last 20 years, conservative ideas have done more to turn around American cities than hundreds of billions of dollars of welfare entitlements, social programs, and public housing over 4 decades ever did. More than 10,000 minority males are alive in New York City today who would have been dead had New York City's homicide rate remained at its early 1990s level. A policy success doesn't get any more concrete than that, and yet it is rarely acknowledged. City Journal has tried to stand up for the primacy of the bourgeois values, and it deserves credit for doing so. Thank you very much.
Does anybody have any questions for Heather? We've got time for several. I have one, actually.
Okay.
You mentioned at the outset of your talk that these ideas, these bad ideas, continue to have defenders. How much of that, in your view, and you talk to advocates all the time, how much of that is principled, and how much of it is what Steve would describe as a kind of racket, that just self-perpetuation of a jobs machine for advocacy?
That's a great question, but I think it's both. It is self-interested, but I do believe that many people's self-image is based on being more righteous than the rest of the world, and being more righteous as they define it depends on understanding that capitalism is an evil force, and that asking the poor to abide by universal standards, make an effort, act responsibly, is simply bigoted and racist. And so I think that they are actually deeply and emotionally, not just philosophically committed to an ideology that is extraordinarily corrosive of opportunity, and is in actually the worst possible interest for the poor.
Any questions? Judy? Wait for the mic if you could.
Heather, we've recently been reading, and you have responded admirably to criticism of CompStat now and the data-driven crime suppression program, that we've come to the end of this. We can't drive crime down any longer, and as a result, precinct commanders and policemen are under-reporting crimes to keep the numbers down. Do you see any evidence of that, and could you share your thoughts on that with us? Thank you.
I don't, Judy. I think that conceit has been based most recently on an extraordinarily flawed study that came out of basically the New York City Captains Union. I hate to say it, as much as I love cops, but they can be sort of lazy at times, and they're pushing back very hard against CompStat because it does require them to work, and it holds them accountable. And being in the hot seat at one police plaza, if you don't have a sound strategy for lowering crime in your precinct, is not a pleasant experience. So the Captains Union underwrote a study claiming that there has been an increase in crime fudging activity since the start of the Giuliani years. It's a completely ludicrous study that simply asked captains in the post-CompStat era if they were aware of anybody changing a crime report. And it asked the identical question to captains from the pre-CompStat era. And it got a slightly higher rate of people saying, I'm aware of a crime report being changed. Two problems with this analysis. A, we don't know if everybody in the post-CompStat era is simply talking about the same few well-publicized incidents. We don't know how many that actually represents. And number two, there's no overlap. So what would have been useful was to ask somebody who had served both before and after CompStat if they had seen behavior change. There are numerous independent checks on the police's crime data. Homicide reports are verified by hospitals and, actuary tables. There has never been any discrepancy, yet homicide is clearly the crime that the public cares about most. The other independent check is auto theft, because people report it to their car is stolen, they report it to their insurance company. Again, there has been no discrepancy. If there was a systematic lowering of crime, it may occur in devaluing a higher level of larceny down to petty larceny, in which case you would expect to see petty larceny go up. That has not happened. Everything has been going down. And New York City has the most rigorous auditing function of any big city police force in the country. So I just don't buy it. I think that it is a department whose professional standards is another thing that New Yorkers don't really appreciate. We kind of take our department for granted, but there's nothing quite like it, not just in terms of its size, which is the one big government program that conservatives should get behind, but its legacy of a sense of professionalism and a belief in its mission that I think is truly extraordinary. So I believe in accountability. You know, I think ultimately what the recent attack on CompStat comes down to is an attack on accountability itself, and that just goes too far. It may be that at the margins, accountability systems will incentivize some kind of fudging, but that's no reason to question them and not to keep forward with what we've got.
Thanks. Fascinating, Heather. One thing I wanted to ask about, which was implicit in your talk, but you didn't flesh it out explicitly, was the war on drugs and the drug trade, which is a major part of crime. And one conservative viewpoint, which isn't universal but pushed by people like William F. Buckley, has been that in fact the war on drugs has helped to precipitate violent crime by empowering the gangs, much as the mafia and others were empowered during Prohibition. Mm-hmm. The Rockefeller-era drug laws here in New York, which predated the rise and existed during the fall of crime that you've chronicled, have recently been loosened. There's effort afoot in Albany to change some of those policies. What's your interpretation of that analysis, that argument, including the conservative critique of the war on drugs?
Jim, I haven't written about this yet. You're asking me to, I don't know if it's been a deliberate avoidance of the topic. To me, it's a purely empirical question, and you know, I would like to have an experiment. If it is the case that the violence from drugs is simply a result of Prohibition, I would like to see that tested, and if it is, I think it's something we should consider. I do tend to defer to the police in things crime-related, and it's very hard to find police officials that support legalization. That having been said, I fully understand the libertarians' observation that what we're dealing with is a completely vicious circle, that it remains the case that if you go to any police community meeting in Harlem or Bushwick, contrary to what you would assume from the ACLU, which tells us that the police are hated and resented for their awful brutality and racial profiling, what you will hear from inner city residents is, A, we want more cops, we want more arrests, and we want the dealers off the streets because they are making our lives miserable and they are terrifying us. Despite the crime drop, there's still a problem, obviously. Now, a libertarian, anti-prohibitionist is obviously going to argue, but it's precisely because it's been criminalized that there is that threat. I would, if we could create a controlled experiment looking at some of the European cities to test it, I would certainly be open to doing that. That having been said, I also think that drugs are not merely a matter of individual experience and choice, that a crack-addicted mother is destroying her children's chances, not 100%, but is making that very hard. So I do think that there are social externalities of hard drug use that also society has a right to account for. But as I say, I haven't done this study, and without that, I really can't. It's an ideological debate at this point, not an empirical one.
Heather, one area where the curve hasn't been bent a lot, I think, is in single parenthood.
Yes.
And studies show that single parenthood is hard and not as successful usually as a full family.
Yeah.
Is government policy still encouraging this, and are there further reforms possible that would encourage the formation of more complete families?
Yeah. That is the absolute unfinished business of welfare reform, and it was the twin hope of the backers of welfare reform, that not only would it start to break the dependency culture, but by saying to mothers that you could no longer expect the government to act as the surrogate father for your children by sending you a monthly welfare check with no strings attached each month, it would start to induce more thought about procreation and whether you want to be a single mother. That didn't happen. To the absolute despair of inner cities, there is no bigger problem impeding the full equality of blacks than the breakdown of the black family. The illegitimacy rate now stands at 73%. This is a cataclysm beyond all expressing and understanding. You have got to have the expectation on boys that they are responsible for their children. I would say that what has not been done and has to be done is to send the unequivocal message that fathers are important. I think every welfare agency, every social service agency, every nonprofit that is getting a government welfare check itself, whether it's as a foster care agency or a job training agency, should be required at some point to work into their program the message of fatherhood. You don't get any money unless you're willing to talk about your clients about that. It's obviously difficult because the middle and upper class have their own family problems. And so it makes a full-throated defense of two-parent family. A lot of people talking about that feel compromised. Nevertheless, it is something we have to do because we are going to continue to experience tragic levels of academic failure and social failure unless we can get the two-parent family together again. And I don't think at this point that there's nuts and bolts policy. Like a lot of policy wonks love to talk about marriage tax credits and, you know, playing with the income tax code. My view is that's a pipe dream. That is not why people in the inner city and for growing numbers of the poor, no matter where they live and what their color are not getting married. It's because the society no longer is willing to stand up to the feminist lie that women can do it all in the family and say that, in fact, two parents are essential to raising children.
Time for 2 more questions.
Good morning, Heather.
Hi, Saul.
The thrust of your talk is that personal responsibility is key to the great society, not the great society.
Our great society, yes.
What are the prospects of teaching personal responsibility in our public schools?
They ought to be great. I mean, in theory, if you were designing a public school from scratch, this is the place to start. It's very simple. Behavior has consequences. That's a rule that should start at home, and if it doesn't, it falls upon the schools, unfortunately, to reinforce that. But as you yourself know, Saul, and Philip Howard has written about this as well, the incessant litigation that ties the hands of administrators and teachers from exerting discipline and sending a clear message of, we expect you to act as civilized young men and women is very murky. I think one of the most scary proposals to come out of the Obama administration Justice Department is a new push to start going after schools for a phrase that I think maybe Jesse Jackson pioneered, of disciplinary profiling, which is that if there is different racial rates of discipline, that means that the schools are racist. Now, this is, of course, a profession that comes out of the most liberal education institution on campus, which is ed schools, and is filled with people who are, idealists. The idea that public school administrators and teachers are somehow administering discipline based on bigotry is simply insane. But this push is going to make it even harder to get rid of troublemakers and will destroy any remaining chances that good kids that just want to learn are going to be able to. So I think unless we can turn around the discipline problem in schools and empower discretionary, good sense, common sense ability to abide by rules, then schools are just contributing to the problem rather than solving it.
Okay, thanks very much. Heather, that's all the time we have for questions. So Heather Malanga. Steve Malanga.
Thank you. In the 1990s, we saw a real ferment of reform in American cities, as Steve Goldsmith mentioned. And this was an era where you had books like David Osborne's Reinventing Government, which, and although the Clinton administration embraced this, this was really about local government. You had not just Rudy Giuliani in New York City, you had mayors like Goldsmith. You also had a mayor like John Norquist in Milwaukee who, writing in City Journal, sort of laid out, I think, what reform was about. And this is key because urban reform is not about just, you know, somebody who wants to do interesting programs. Let's try this, let's try that, let's make government a little bit more efficient. What John Norquist said in City Journal was, for 40 years, American cities have blamed their problems on someone else and have gone consistently to the federal government and said, bail us out. And Norquist told a story in City Journal, which I find startling. He said, you know, I went to the U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting shortly after the Los Angeles riots. This was in 1992. And there was almost a sense of glee among the mayors there. What were they so gleeful about? That Washington could no longer ignore American cities, that the aid was going to be forthcoming because of this. And as Norquist said at the time, this is just a fantasy that cities have been living, and mayors and the people who run cities have been living since the 1960s. And instead, Norquist, he called this tin cup urbanism. And he said, it's time to reject tin cup urbanism. This is America. The American economy, American innovation was created in our cities. Cities are masters of their own destiny. It's time for cities to take back their destiny because that's where the most talented people in America reside. Rudy Giuliani picked it up and said this often. He said, by constantly going to Washington for help, we're essentially completely excusing our own political class for the problems they've created. Steve said, cities have to become economically competitive again. That means good services at reasonable prices. One of Steve's answers was outsourcing competitive bidding, but it was the concept. Cities have to become competitive again. The solution is not outside the cities, but within the cities. So there were lots of things that happened in the 90s. Welfare reform was tried in cities like New York, like Milwaukee, and in the state of Wisconsin, well before President Clinton signed his order. Charter schools, which people had talked about, were formed in cities so that by the end of the 1990s, you had several million American children who were in charter schools. We didn't have vouchers, but at least we had several million children with an alternative. Competitive bidding was done at the local level. And of course, policing, which really gained traction here in New York City. Now, somewhere around 2000, which was when I came to the Institute, and I had been following the Institute's work very carefully because I had been at Cranes since the late 80s and was very aware of what they were doing, so it wasn't a surprise when I came here. But somewhere around 2000, people started saying, well, who's the next generation of reform mayors? And nobody could come up with a good answer to that. And as people asked that question, one of the things that we looked around, you always found mayors who were doing interesting things. Martin O'Malley trying to take the idea of ComStat in Baltimore and turn it into CityStat. Things like that. But none of it seemed to rise to the level of reform. And over time, at City Journal, in our discussions, the question of who's the next generation of reform mayors actually sort of evolved into the question of what happened to the urban reform movement of the 1990s. And we asked this question over and over again. Other than places like New York City where it was being sustained and the gains were multiplying, what happened to the urban reform movement? And I had to take up this question again for the anniversary issue. And finally I thought I'd try a different tact. And I started looking at a couple of mayors that I really admired. One was Cory Booker. Another was a mayor who had just been elected. And what I had really admired was his campaign for mayor, his agenda, which I thought as I read it sounded like something that City Journal would write as an urban agenda, and that was Dave Bing, the former NBA great in Detroit. And I also thought, wow, Bing's agenda sounds so much like Cory Booker's agenda in Newark. And I thought, well, what is it about these mayors that appeals to me? And then I realized, and I remembered that, reform is not just about doing a few things here or there. Let's take this program that somebody is running somewhere else and see if we can do it here. Reform really is about rejecting the past and heading off in a completely new direction. And I was reminded that what Dave Bing and Cory Booker are trying to do is essentially overturn a culture of corruption and patronage that has ruled their cities so that the great urban reforms of the 1990s completely passed them by. And it's a different kind of corruption, but it's one that has grabbed cities that have not felt and seen revival, like Cleveland and Buffalo are other examples. What I call it is the war on poverty patronage machine. You see, in the 1950s and the 40s and the 30s, and going all the way back to the 19th century, many cities were ruled by political machines like Tammany Hall, and they were ethnic political machines. And they thrived on patronage and even on corruption. In the 1960s, we saw a different kind of political machine emerge. The federal government, with its war on poverty, said, we're going to spend billions, tens of billions, ultimately hundreds of billions of dollars to try to cure urban poverty and revive cities. The architects of the war on poverty were somewhat naive. They didn't quite know how to do this, but they thought to themselves, what we're going to do is send much of this money to local leaders and local groups, and they are going to work their magic in their neighborhoods. What the war on poverty did do is create thousands and tens of thousands, ultimately, of groups that lived entirely off of government money, running everything from subsidized housing, daycare centers, job training centers. What these individuals quickly realized who ran and set up these organizations is that in order to keep the government money flowing, one of the things that they had to do is become politically active to protect their grants, to protect their programs. And so we saw the creation of essentially social service empires. Here in New York, we're very familiar with them. Ramon Velez in the Bronx, whom Mayor Koch famously called a poverty pimp. Pedro Espada Sr., who created an empire for himself and his son later, up in Soundview. Today, Vito Lopez, one of the most powerful Democrats in the Assembly, in Ridgewood, Queens, that sprawling social service complex, which is essentially where the voting machines are actually placed in the facilities in that district of the Ridgewood, Queens social service empire. And we saw, and when I came to City Journal, I started writing about this outside of New York, I saw that the road to political power in many places increasingly, in many other cities increasingly ran through this kind of social services network. In places like Newark and Detroit, this kind of federally subsidized corruption became endemic. And so the great institutions of those cities, the crucial institutions of those cities, were withered away. In Newark, where Chris Christie made his reputation putting people in jail who governed in Newark, as well as the rest of New Jersey. In Newark, the police commissioner in the 1990s was sent to jail for stealing money from a federal drug program meant to help stymie the drug trade in Newark. In Newark, in 1990s, a federal prosecutor called City Hall a supermarket where anything was for sale. The Newark Housing Authority, according to an audit by HUD, was taking money that was meant for capital expenditures. It was meant to paint facilities. It was meant to do basic maintenance. And they were using it to hire people and to grow essentially the organization and not spend money on maintenance, because the Newark Housing Authority was, even back in the days when I was growing up in Newark, essentially a patronage machine. In Detroit, Coleman Young was elected with so much hope in the early 1970s. Young did two things. He adopted the ideology that said that it's the federal government's role to bail us out. And he attacked the institutions in Detroit that he was responsible for, namely the police department, that he disliked. And so in the middle of this great growth in crime in the 1970s and early 80s, he cut the size of the Detroit Police Department by 20%, so that Detroit, like Newark, which I remember vividly, when you called 911, you couldn't even be sure that a police car would show up. The police commissioner of Detroit went to jail also for stealing money from the Detroit drug funds. The education system in both of these cities was taken over by the states because they were stealing so much money, stealing money essentially from kids, that neither state could trust the cities to run their own education department. When Cory Booker took over Newark and he went through the precincts in Newark, and this was in 2005, the cops didn't have computers in Newark. We'd been using, we're talking about, City Journal's writing about ComStat, computer-generated, data-driven policing. They didn't even have computers. Where had the money gone in a city like Newark? Where had the money gone in Detroit, where, at the height of the Coleman Young reign, 1/3 to 50% of all city workers were being paid by federal and state subsidies? Where did the money go? So these had become war on poverty patronage machines, and as a result, the reforms of the 1990s had completely bypassed these cities as well as several others. And it was clear if you listened to Bing and to Booker, their message was, we're responsible for our own future. And so, to give you an example, rather than saying every time there's a shortfall in the budget or every time we need something, rather than demanding it of Washington, one of the things Cory Booker did is he started a police fund for people who wanted to support the city. And they've used that police fund to buy all the equipment that those tax dollars for years were supposed to be buying that just disappeared. Instead, they did it with private donations, including a gunshot detection system, including computers. Booker set up an education fund. The city's school system is still not in his control. But he said, rather than simply fight for that control, and rather than tell parents whose kids are in bad schools, just wait a few years, I'll get control back, he set up a fund, he's raised $10 million, used that fund to start charter schools. He said, if they're not going to let me run my own schools, we're going to start alternate schools, charter schools. Dave Bing is actually now doing the same thing. A group of businesses, including the Detroit Area Chamber of Commerce and others, have gotten behind him because of who he is. And they have essentially said, we want control of our schools back, but what we're also going to do is raise $200 million and start opening charter schools around the city to show you, the state, how we can do it. So there's a very different attitude in both of these cities right now, and it isn't just an attitude which says, let's do some interesting things. It's an attitude which says, we're responsible for our own destiny. Now, there are lots of other American cities which could use just such a jolt. I was on a television program, and did I see John Stossel here? I think he is here. Hi, John. I was on a television program about Cleveland that John did, which was essentially really about urban reform. And this was about Drew Carey, who comes from Cleveland, I think was one of the motivations for John doing this particular, and Drew was on. And one of the things that struck me about Cleveland, another city that continues to have this kind of what John Norquist called tin cup urbanism. In Cleveland, the police department, the chief of police, it's still a patronage job. They've had 14 police chiefs since Dennis Kucinich was mayor back in the late 1970s. They still are arguing about who's the right police chief for Cleveland. If you read newspapers in Cleveland, they write feature stories about how in the springtime, that's car theft season in Cleveland, and people's cars start disappearing, and people have all these strategies for trying to take care of their cars in Cleveland. The Comstat, it's still a patronage position. Buffalo, the city of Buffalo, another city which certainly the global economic forces have had a lot to do with Buffalo's decline, but so has the leadership in Buffalo. Buffalo, according to a study by the Buffalo News, has received more federal urban aid per capita than any city in America. In an investigation that the Buffalo News did, they said, you can barely find any evidence of this money anywhere in the city. Where is it mostly? And I talked to some of the reformers on the city council up there. The place you can mostly find it is in social service organizations and social service contracting being done by people who are in some way or another related to the political machinery, the political culture of the city. But otherwise, nothing. If our federal urban aid or anti-poverty aid actually worked, then Buffalo would be a shining example to the rest of the country, but it clearly doesn't. So I think if you look at a place like Newark, and we've had 5 years of Mayor Booker there, and you look at a place like Detroit, and you look at the agenda, what you see is mayors saying, as they were saying in the 1990s, it's our destiny. It's not about someone else. And the real challenge for cities like that, for cities, and I would put Cleveland and Buffalo into that mix also, the real challenge for those cities that the urban revolution of the 90s bypassed is that they've lost so much of their middle class, they've lost so much of their business infrastructure, that it's going to take several terms, it may even take several mayors. And the question is whether this kind of reform can endure without immediate results. Dennis Archer actually was a reform mayor in the 1990s in Detroit, spent his time battling the Coleman-Young political machine, which still existed even though Coleman-Young was gone. And I think this is the challenge of a place like Newark, because unlike New York City, where you still had Wall Street and you still had a middle class in the outer boroughs, so that as soon as crime started declining in New York City, you saw this incredible rebirth. It's going to take a long time to rebuild cities like that. But the notion that the cities are themselves in charge of their destiny is, I think, a crucial one, and it's one that I hope more and more reform candidates around the country will look at a guy like Booker or a guy like Bing and say, that's the road to reform for our city. That's the agenda that we need. Thank you.
Questions for Steve? I've got one to start things off, Steve. You didn't mention something that I think is a big problem in both Detroit and Newark, which is returning criminals coming out of coming out of jail. I know Mayor Booker has been doing some innovative things on this front. Maybe you want to say a little bit about this.
Yes, although I'm not the best person at the Manhattan Institute to talk about this, but when Mayor Booker, first of all, Cory Booker was a city councilman before he was a mayor. And the word got out on the street that if you really wanted help and you wanted a straight shooter, you should go see Cory Booker. And what started happening is a lot of guys being released from jail started knocking on Cory Booker's door when he was a councilman and saying, can you get us a job? I really need a job. Here are all the problems I have. I don't want to go back on the street. I really need a job. And at times, Booker will tell you, there were a couple of guys sleeping on the floor of his apartment. Well, when he took office, a number of people went to see him, including people from the Manhattan Institute, who had worked on the notion of welfare to work. And essentially, the discussion was, what we haven't tried with criminals is a form of welfare to work called rapid attachment to work, which essentially says, listen, we're not going to send those who have just come out of jail to school for 6 months or a year. They have immediate needs. We're going to get them a job, but we're also going to be very close. We're going to have counselors helping them through each stage of the process. When they have to go to court because they have child support payments, we're going to be there for them. We're going to get them back into the workplace and get them through the first 6 months to a year. There's a major program being run in Newark, which is, Cory Booker has actually made helped make a video, the Institute actually made a video with Booker. I urge you to go to our website and watch this. In it, Cory talks about the dignity of work. He has it exactly right. He also knows, as he said many times, he's adapted the data-driven policing of New York City, and he said many times, every time I said to people, I want to make your city safer, they said, yes, but what are we going to do with all the people you put in jail? And he says, they're right about that. And this is my response. This is a very, recidivism is a very tough problem. The results so far are very good. Whether it is replicable in other places, we'll see. But it's worth investigating. And I think at some point we ought to have Mayor Booker here to talk a little bit about that experience. I'm sure that'll happen soon. Are you going to tell me about that, or you have a question? Oh, okay.
Steve, the mayors that you described as reformers are both Democrats. And one of the problems, especially with corruption, is that most of America's major cities are one-party towns. Steve Goldsmith was unusual. In Indianapolis is a place that has traditionally elected Republicans to the mayor's office.
New York City, too.
New York City, too, although an apparent successor to this 20-year run is not there. So my question is, can the Republican Party ever be a force in urban centers, a real political force? And if you think it could, how would you start that process?
This was one of my early stories, actually, was about the Republican Party in places like New York City. I think a couple of things. It's ironic that, and this goes back to Heather's speech, is that so many of the positive forces in urban reform are, in fact, products of not a Republican Party, but a conservative point of view. And yet, they've been resisted in many cities outside of places like New York. And here's the essential issue. One of the differences between New York and a lot of other cities, and I think this is probably true of Indianapolis and a lot of other cities too, is New York had retained a middle class. As much as we talk about the flight of the middle class out of New York, there was a middle class. That middle class voted for reform. That middle class was looking for reform, and that middle class responded when they saw the changes around them. If you look at the problems that Adrian Fenty has had in Washington, essentially being voted out of office because of his education reforms, you can understand some of the difficulties that cities are going to have. A city like Newark needs to rebuild its middle class. Cory Booker is trying to do that. I didn't talk about whole parts of his agenda. I don't see a future for the Republican Party as it's currently constituted in cities, because when I call Republican leaders in Washington and I ask them this question, as I have in the past, their response is sort of like, oh yeah, you know, you're right, those are really conservative principles. I don't think, I mean, as you know, the Manhattan Institute was created in part because the conservatives seem to have given up on the cities. I think you have two different kinds of cities. There's an opportunity for reformists who may run on the Republican agenda in a place like New York City. I think that in places like Newark and Detroit, I think those cities have to rebuild their middle class before you see Republican Party back in the cities. That's almost putting the cart after the horse, but I don't really see it. Now, if we want to talk about the Republican Party in New York City, that's a whole other issue. But here's the thing, Larry. Republican, Democrat, People have asked me, and perhaps I was even naive enough to think, well, you know, when Rudy Giuliani was mayor, why couldn't he build a flourishing Republican Party? People have asked me, well, what is it that changed Newark so that they voted for Cory Booker? What is it that changed Detroit so that they voted for Dave Bing? What is it that changed New York? They voted for Rudy Giuliani on a Republican line and then Mike Bloomberg on a Republican line. What is it that changed even New Jersey so that they voted for Chris Christie? And one of the things that I've sort of come to decide about reform politics is it's not about parties, it's about individuals. That in a sense, the Democratic Party in Newark did not suddenly get good, get better, and produce Cory Booker. That if Cory Booker had not come along, Newark would still have many of the problems that it had. That Democratic Party in Detroit hasn't changed at all. It's essentially the war on poverty party. That Dave Bing came along and said enough. Same thing with the Republican Party in New Jersey. It didn't get any better. Chris Christie just came along and said, I'm going to do it. So it's really reform. I mean, I believe it was Carlyle who said history is made by great men. Let's say today history is made by great men and great women. It really is about individuals who emerge, not about necessarily a structure that creates them out of nowhere. And certainly I think that's true in Newark and Detroit.
Michael Myers, New York Civil Rights Coalition. Steve, I think you downplay the impact, particularly in the 60s and 70s, of white flight from the cities. Not just the middle class, but middle class whites, jobs, industry, and everything that went with that. Left the cities out of fear of crime, urban blight, or for better housing elsewhere. Whatever the rationalizations and the reasons were. And but at the same time as there was white flight, there were still leaders, and there you go with the individuals. There were leaders, particularly in New Jersey, and I know something about New Jersey. This Newark school system wasn't taken over because of financial corruption. But you had leaders like a Republican, Thomas Kean, who really believed that children in the inner cities were educable. And he would not give up on them. And he put money into the school systems, and he put in commissioners of education who would take over local school districts who resisted the notion that black children could learn. And so, yes, you did have individual leaders, the commissioner of education, the governor of New Jersey, and people in leadership who insisted on putting urban universities, science, technology in Newark and other places, art, to make sure it came back and tried to bring back the middle class and the whites to the city. And I think, yes, the Manhattan Institute and others refused to give up on the city when so many white middle class people ran away.
Well, first of all, I grew up in Newark. And we never left Newark. But everybody around us left. Why did they leave? Now, I will tell you, Michael, that when we had people trying to break into my house when I was 11 years old with my 3 brothers, and I called 911 when my parents weren't home and no cops showed up. That's why people left, Michael. I don't blame people for leaving. I saw my neighbors leave. I don't blame them for leaving. We stayed. My father wrote letters to the Star-Ledger. We stayed. But here's the thing. It's not as if the opportunity was there. People talk about we can talk about Cleveland, we can talk about Buffalo, great global forces which maybe had an impact. But that was not the case in Newark. Yes, industrialization hurt Newark, but Newark is in the middle of the New York, Boston, Washington corridor. Newark became a great transportation hub with tens of thousands of jobs. None of those jobs were going to Newark residents. Cory Booker came in and said, let's start having job fairs at Newark Airport. Newark Airport has been one of the fastest growing airports in the country. Let's start having job fairs at Newark Airport. At the time that Newark was declining, companies were leaving New York City and going to the rest of New Jersey. There was tremendous opportunity. But if you have fear, if you have crime, if you have a corrupt police department, remember, the police commissioner of Newark was selected by the mafia. If you have a corrupt police department, people are in fear. And I don't blame my neighbors for leaving.
Nicole, Gelinas.
Good morning. And I'll add one more city to Steve's very heartening list of democratic cities that are beginning to adopt urban reform, and that's New Orleans. 5 years after Katrina, New Orleans finally has a new mayor, and he said something that no mayor has said there for 40 years, that having a per capita murder rate of 8 times New York City's is simply unacceptable. You have to hold me to cutting crime. And previously they said, well, we're a poor city, we're just going to have a lot of crime, you just have to deal with it. So they're not certainly anywhere near where they need to be, but they finally made some progress in choosing a leader who wants to do this. And some people say, well, you know, New Orleans, after Katrina, they re-elected Ray Nagin. Why did they do that? Well, they did not think that they could elect some hero from on high to come and save them, solve their problems overnight. They knew that they had very hard work to do for years to figure out what it was that they wanted from their government, from the ground up, from the city council on up, and then choose a mayor who was doing what the people wanted, not coming in as a Deus ex machina. So that's not what I'm talking about today. So as Steve and Heather both eloquently said this morning, and as John Poderitz wrote in the newspaper this morning as well, cities can certainly generate themselves, but this does not happen magically. It requires good ideas and good leaders. It is a much, much bigger challenge if there is one other ingredient that is missing, and that is a Congress that is hurting more than it is helping. And unfortunately, that's what we've had over the past few years, and we've seen something very pernicious happening that could affect the future progress of cities and could roll back some of the progress that we've made if we're not careful about it and if we don't understand what's going on. So that's what I'm here to hopefully do. Cities, certainly, they control their own destinies, have a lot of autonomy. Fiscally, however, they're creations of the state. They depend on state government for much of their revenues, particularly education. They depend on state government for much of their ability to enact tax policy. That includes lowering tax rates as well as raising them in many cases. And they depend indirectly on state credit. If you've got a state with a terrible credit rating, towns and cities in that state, it would be unlikely for them to be able to raise money on good terms because of these other factors, that they are dependent on states for much of the fiscal side. What has happened over 50 years tells us that what Congress does with states and cities matters a lot. We are still fighting the effects of 50s and 60s, really 60s and 70s era programs that came from cities and states to Washington and back down to the rest of the cities and states. And that, of course, war on poverty, urban renewal, social justice agitation. We're still trying to get out from underneath some of those problems. What Congress is doing now is not hurting cities with bulldozers and social justice agitators. It's a little bit more pernicious. It's hurting cities with money, or it has been for the past 2 years. Where does that money come from? It comes from stimulus. And to get into why this is the case, I'll go through some of what cities have been doing wrong over the past 20 years in addition to what they've been doing right. They've been vastly increasing their spending in many cases. They could do this and still have money to do things right because we were in an enormous first a tech bubble and then the credit bubble. So you had lots of room to make mistakes. That is not so much the case anymore. So we have to be very careful with the money that we have to make sure that we are using it to improve the city rather than hurt it over the long term. Over just the past decade, we can see this in New York City. In 2002, the city spent about $50 billion a year in today's dollars. This year, it'll spend $67 billion. Going back 9 years ago, the city spent 14% of its budget on public employee benefits, that's pensions and health care. Today, it'll spend 23% of its budget on these two items. So you can see that retiree liabilities are crowding out ability to provide public service, public safety, public infrastructure, and at the same time keep taxes to a level where people are not leaving. During the same time frame in New York, debt per capita also rose. Used to be about $6,200 a year per person in today's dollars. Now it's more than $7,000. And to New York's credit, we have actually built some infrastructure with this money. We're building a third water tunnel. That's very important, the two that we depend on, aging. In the rest of the country and a lot of other cities, you see vast increases in debt outstanding. Nationwide, municipal debt is up about 85% over the past decade, and you don't see a lot of new infrastructure. So that's a very bad sign. What has happened? They've spent money from raising debt on maintaining the old infrastructure because they've been using the money they have from income on increasing education costs, increasing health costs, in racking up their future liabilities for bondholders, for pensioners, and for healthcare in the meanwhile. This is all something that clearly has to change. If it doesn't, 10 years from now, cities will have to cut back on core public services because they will be paying more and more of their money on the long-term liabilities that they are continuing to rack up. 2 years ago was a good time for this to begin to change. We saw the beginning of a historic financial, economic, and fiscal crisis. The problem with stimulus is that it tried to maintain the status quo. For the past 2 years, we've had $25 billion every quarter drip into state and city budgets from Washington so that the states can keep increasing their healthcare costs, so that they can allow cities to keep increasing pension liabilities, healthcare liabilities, bond liabilities. Debt is up another 18% since the housing bubble burst. States and cities have not had to cut back spending. Washington has given them the money. Some cities have tried to fight this and keep on doing the right thing. Indianapolis, for one. Other cities and states, New York, California, took the money and kept increasing spending. What is happening now? Stimulus is drying up. We see in New York State that state Medicaid costs are probably going to rise 14% next year because the federal money has gone away. What will that do to a city like New York? Well, the state will cut its aid to the city and say to the city, you've got to deal with it yourself. We'll let you raise taxes or you can cut your services. That's, in some ways, a good case scenario. One thing cities have going for them right now is liquidity. They can still raise money from bond markets. They can still raise money internally. If investors start to worry that the Republican Congress won't be there, that could stop. And what we could see is massive cuts in public services, police, garbage, libraries, the things that middle-class people want to stay in the city, and at the same time, no movement on these long-term liabilities that just keep growing and growing. So if that doesn't happen, it's even worse because you allow them liquidity to keep building up a problem that's just going to get worse year after year. So what's the good news? The good news is that we know what to do here. This is common sense. We have a Republican Congress now. We've got to incentivize states and cities to do the right thing rather than the wrong thing. And this, the federal government, to its credit, has done some of this on charter schools, for example. We can do this fiscally as well. Every few years, Congress puts together an infrastructure plan for states, and this is $200 billion over 6 years or so forth. What Congress has done over the decades is say, just spend as much of this infrastructure money on your unions, on your favorite pet projects, on patronage and so forth, and don't worry about it. What Congress should do is say we're going to do a race to the top for infrastructure. This has been neglected for decades. We're going to ask cities and states to compete for this money and say these are the projects that will create the most economic benefit. The Congress could have a moratorium on a lot of the federal rules that push the price of these projects up. 5 years, say, no Davis-Bacon law that makes you pay union wages even to non-union workers. No laws that say you can't use federal money to build a bus depot if you're going to have private workers work there rather than public workers, and see what states and cities can accomplish in competing how you're going to do a project with rewards for doing it fast, doing it cheaply, and achieving economic benefits quickly. The better you do this, the more money you'll get in the future. At the same time, any aid that goes to the states from now on, just for the operating budgets, what we've been doing for the past 2 years, what could certainly continue on a lower level and won't be called stimulus, just because Republicans are just as afraid as the Democrats are about rising unemployment rates, state and city layoffs. Any new aid should only be tied to cuts in long-term liabilities. This is what the stimulus should have done, said, okay, yes, you need New York, you need some cash right now. In return, you've got to work with the legislature, work with the unions, raise the future retirement age, optimally go to pension plans where the workers control it rather than have the taxpayers on the hook, and say, the more you cut down these future liabilities, fine, we'll be willing to give you some money right now. This would be vastly preferable to sending more money to maintain a status quo that cannot be maintained in the end, and risks rolling back a lot of the urban progress that we've made. So again, not so much a bad news story, because these are common sense problems, common sense solutions. Only a bad news story if it is ignored for more months, more years, and it is allowed to fester. So thank you.
Nicole, you say we've been neglecting infrastructure for 20 years. How grave is that neglect, and how pressing is the problem?
Well, I mean, we have an example right here in New York with the MTA. We had the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, state-run authority, again, shows how important state policy is to states, because we still depend on state government for public transportation, which in New York is really only second to crime in terms of quality of life. MTA is certainly much better than it was in the 1970s, in the early 80s, but we see warning signs there. First of all, we had the biggest boom that the city has ever seen, and the state as well, between 2000, 2007. After inflation, tax revenues in the city went up 45%. We did not use this money to build vastly better infrastructure. We've just begun to do this just as the money has run out. In the meantime, public employee wages, benefits at the MTA have just kept going up and up and up. You've got token clerks that make $57,000 a year, plus on top of that, retirement benefits, healthcare benefits that bring it nearly into the six figures for a retail level job. Unsustainable. What does this do? It takes money away from the infrastructure. You're putting money into the operating costs rather than into the capital budget. This is exactly what GM and Ford and Chrysler did, and by the time they started to change this 5 years ago, it was too late for GM and Chrysler to do this without bankruptcy. We don't want it to become too late here. The MTA now has its new capital plan. It's got to spend $25 billion over the next 6 years just to keep the existing assets in good working order, keep the tracks in good shape, keep the signals in good shape. It does not know where it's going to get the money from. It has a third of this money in hand, and yet the state continues to give raises to employees, continues to allow these same benefits to exist. And the state says its behavior is based on the city's own behavior. If the city gives people raises, the state has no choice but to do the same. So you see how the political class remains in a bubble. The financial crisis should have started to pop that bubble, but it didn't. And we're already seeing delays on the subways because they've cut service, trains are more crowded, it takes longer for them to stop at stops. This affects people's quality of life. If we don't start to turn it around, it could get worse.
Questions for Nicole? Any? Yes, Steve? Well, yeah.
This is quick and off the cuff, but I'm sure you saw today in the New York Times that the city is now proposing possibly extending the number 7 train into New Jersey to replace the giant tunnel at about half the cost. I'm wondering what your response is, if any, to that.
Yeah, it's good fiscal management for Chris Christie to get New York to pay for it. That's a good progress. And no, I mean, I think that it's a good idea to increase rail capacity from New York to New Jersey, no matter how we do it, who pays for it. You know, the existing New Jersey Transit tunnel, it is vulnerable to any problem, whether it's rain, a storm, a delayed train. This also hurts people's quality of life, and it's as frequent as once a month in many cases. You can't grow jobs in New York City, in urban areas of New Jersey, unless you grow transit capacity. But this goes back to the point that you can't do these things unless you get the labor costs under control. We don't want to be in a position where we can't even think about, can we finish the 2nd Avenue subway? Can we do the number 7 train to New Jersey? Because we are worried about keeping cops and sanitation people on the street because we're paying for retirement benefits.
Given the lack of capital available for infrastructure, what is the role of public-private partnerships to raise that capital to get the infrastructure done?
I think it's a great question, and it's a very good option. Private-public partnership, doing, and Steve has written about this in the past as well, doing what European nations, Latin American nations have been doing for years. Instead of the MTA or the state managing construction of a capital project, you bid it out to concessionaire who would be responsible for the life cycle of the project, if not just building it, but also maintaining it and operating it. And that way, they have an incentive not to cut costs in construction because they'll be running it for 10, 20 years, not to cut costs in operation because they want people on board and paying the fares, and raising money in the capital markets that does not go on the state and city balance sheet becomes a greater benefit as states and cities lose room to raise debt on their own. However, I would say that it does not solve political problems. If politicians don't do this right, you bring your political problems to the public-private partnership. We've seen states that say, okay, these guys, they don't have to adhere to the union rules, they don't have to hire the same people. And we've seen states that say, yeah, you can do PPP, but you've got to keep the same workers at the same wages and benefits, which doesn't do you a tremendous amount of good. And private sector won't take risk on some projects. Private sector would certainly not take risk on New York City subway. There's too many hidden possible problems. They would not take the revenue risk on a lot of new infrastructure problems where there's no traffic history. So you still have government needing to prioritize its money. You've got to have some city money there to pay a capacity payment for the private sector concessionaire to pay its own costs. So there's no pot of money there that takes away the problems. It's just another tool, but you still need good urban leadership and good urban prioritization of the budget to get there.
Thank you. It seems that the New York City economy is too dependent on the financial sector. Is there anything in the infrastructure changes that would allow it to diversify, maybe go back to more manufacturing or other industries?
Yeah, I think that there's a few different things in there, and that gives me an excuse to talk about other ways in which Washington has hurt New York in the past couple of years. Allowing financial industry to become more dependent on the government, not good for New York. It wasn't good for Detroit in 1979. You are rewarding people who are not getting ahead based on their own innovation. They're getting ahead based on their ability to take the economy hostage and get these bailouts. Over time, that's not good for Wall Street. It means good people have to compete with bad people who are around because of these government guarantees. And it's not good for the city because you've got a growing financial industry. It quadrupled as a share of the economy from the 80s till 2006. If it keeps growing at that rate, it would take over the entire economy. Not going to happen. And if New York keeps spending as if it will happen, it will be a harder awakening than it's been over the past 3 years. Diversifying the economy, this depends on better infrastructure. Tech people, for example, can go out and live in California. They have options where they can have beautiful quality of life. We have to have competitive quality of life here, but it also depends on a lot of other things, tax policy. We have a tax system in New York State and City where the only people who can pay the taxes are the people making these multi-million-dollar bonuses, in part because they've got implicit access to the federal balance sheet. You've got to lower the tax rate. In order to do that, you've got to start fixing these Wall Street distortions. The headwinds are against the city here because of federal policy, but the city can do a lot of this itself. The mayor, the state as well, should be saying any money that we get from outsized Wall Street profits should not be going into the operating budget. They should be going into the capital budget, and they should be going back to the taxpayers. We should not be using windfall money to close operating deficits.
What you say is terrific. Can you give us the names of any elected officials who agree with you? But apart from that, you seem to have a high regard for infrastructure and hard construction. And I would make the point that a lot of the hard construction and infrastructure built by the MTA and the Port Authority is in fact useless and needless. I'll give you 3 projects. The South Ferry Station for $500 million, the Fulton Street Terminal, which is $1.2 billion and still going up, where there was a reasonably satisfactory facility there before, which could have been modernized at much lower cost, and the Calatrava design for the Port Authority path trains. A terminal in New York was just finished building it at a cost of $322 million. Now they want another one at the cost of billions. So just because it's sort of hard costs as opposed to going to salary and payroll expenses doesn't mean that it's a valid or legitimate expenditure.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Why are we doing the Fulton Street Terminal? Because Sheldon Silver wanted it. It's in his district. The same political problems, the same corruption problems, the same inefficiency problems are all there in infrastructure, but the answer to that is not to starve the capital budget and just increase the inefficiency, corruption, and political problems in education, in healthcare. We need to address these problems, but still we need to make room for capital in the budget by cutting the labor costs. And one thing that the MTA does not focus on, and it should, and this comes from the state and the city, is increasing the output of the current transit assets. You speed up the trains so you can get more trains on the lines. You take an hour and 20-minute commute to Coney Island, which is simply unacceptable, and make it a 40-minute commute, and you've just increased property values out in outer Brooklyn. Same thing in the Bronx, same thing on Staten Island. So there's a lot that we can do that would be better. We won't be able to do any of it if we don't get a handle on our labor liabilities. Same thing with the auto companies. I mean, you can build a bad car or a good car, but you got to build something. You can't just pay people's health care.
Right here. Well, wait for the mic, please.
Nicole, it's very difficult to retain a middle class at the same time attempting to reduce labor costs. That is, by not maintaining union wage scales, by reducing the income which is received by public employees,
it's very difficult to retain that population in New York City or other cities that you'd love to do. You know, perhaps there's some sort of compromise, or perhaps you have some magic solution for doing this?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, that it is hard to maintain a middle class in the city. The problem is you've got high earners and public sector earners who are squeezing out private sector, middle class entrepreneurship and jobs. We saw this starting 40 years ago when the manufacturing jobs started to disappear. The problem is you raise spending based on the increase in the highest earners' wages. That is very volatile. It goes down, and then you raise taxes on everybody. We saw this in 2002. Mayor Bloomberg raised property taxes, hit the middle class, raised sales taxes, hits working class and the middle class, and raised income taxes, which hurts the wealthy. The middle class people in the private sector see their wages decrease, see their jobs disappear, because their employers don't want to pay these New York City taxes. The public employee jobs stay here, but they crowd out the private sector middle class jobs. And these jobs, by the way, talking about compromise, you've got the average union worker at the MTA, when you consider salary, pension, benefits, Social Security, it's well over 6 figures now. And so in a lot of cases, just a wage freeze would have been a sign of goodwill over the past 3 years, that you are raising fares, cutting bus service to working class neighborhoods, making it more difficult for someone to get to a job, working as a home health aide, but yet the union members are still making, 4% raises over 3 years. No one has been willing to compromise an inch. And that's a sign that the unions know that the game is very fragile right now, that if they give an inch, eventually it will be a mile. Getting them to give that first inch is going to take enormous amounts of political leadership.
We have time for one more question. I guess in the back of the room there.
Hello, Tom Murphy. I want to go back to your speech. You were listing the downside costs in the future for the city, and you didn't mention welfare. And that wasn't an oversight. That because Mayor Giuliani drove that cost down, as was, I believe it was Mr. McMahon who wrote it up, that the city was hemorrhaging from welfare costs, and everything else could be paid for if we only take this away. Now, that seems to have happened and afforded us some of the benefits through the Giuliani administration. Then at the end, about 10 years ago, he cut a deal with the unions and bumped up the pensions. So that now we have pensions of over $100,000 a year, free of tax from the state, free of tax from the city, and you can go most any state and spend it all anyway. That created a big problem for Mr. Bloomberg. As soon as he came in, right after 9/11, it hit the fan. And he's been taken down in his ability to do things, especially with infrastructure, I think, because of pensions. He never stops talking about them. Could you give us a little advice as to how we should proceed with this?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. The gains in welfare were enormous, and we still benefit today. Not even, the fiscal part is not even as important as the social benefits. We do have Medicaid. 1 out of every 4 New Yorkers is on Medicaid in the city, and that's an enormous cost. The difference between welfare and pensions, or one difference, is we didn't make a legal and constitutional a promise to welfare beneficiaries that if you don't work for 25 years, we will pay you X amount of money for the rest of your life. We do make a constitutional contract with pensioners. If you work for 25 years, in some cases 20 years in cases of uniformed employees. You will get X amount of money for the rest of your life. That is a promise that cannot be unwound. It is arguably more airtight than a promise to bondholders. So these are future liabilities that are much more difficult to unwind. That is why it's important to do it before they come due in a way that is very visceral for people seeing the service cuts, because you can't cut it back when there is crisis. You can, but it is very difficult, and it is too late then to do it in an orderly fashion. It would take a miracle not to have a panic and severe disruptions in middle-class services. And it's also more difficult because these are middle-class benefits. It's harder politically, although it's getting easier. I mean, the public is understanding this better than they did 10 years ago, that yes, we want public employees to have a good income, reasonable pension, but they should not be retiring in their 40s and being retired for longer than they have worked. So we've kind of, in some ways, we're winning the public battle. It is just getting over the special interest, the political side of it that's very difficult. The mayor has complained about pensions. He had leverage on pensions not to give public workers raises, teachers in particular, until they changed the pensions. That was something that didn't occur. It was salaries, which is what the pensions are based on in the Department of Education. They're up 42%, and so the pension liability is also up as the salary goes up. So there are things that the mayor can do, and it's good that he is very interested in this topic right now. He's got plenty of tools to make some progress here.
Okay, thanks very much, Nicole.
Thanks, Brian.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.